Well, having entered graduate school with a sort of unsophisticated, not to say simple-minded, interest in Southern history in a city that was part of the borderland South, Baltimore, I soon focused more specifically on the era of the Civil War and Reconstruction. I was interested not only in these events going on in my time and in the past, these events in the South, but even more in the attitudes of Northerners toward the South, subconsciously echoing perhaps my own situation. My years in graduate school were also the early years of the Civil Rights Movement, of the sit-ins and the Woolworths and so on, and other public facilities in the South, of the Freedom Riders, of so-called massive resistance to federal law by Southern political leaders, of federal marshals and federal troops being sent into the South to enforce national law, of Martin Luther King trying to persuade President Kennedy to issue a new Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1963, the 100th anniversary of the original. If these parallels between the 1960s and 1860s were not enough to impress the young historian in search of a dissertation topic, my experiences as one of many students and spouses at Hopkins, including my wife, who with students at Morgan State College, a predominantly black school in Baltimore, took part in the sit-ins and picketing of segregated restaurants and theaters in Maryland, reinforced my feeling of what we might call historical deja vu. I remember one incident with particular clarity. Several dozen students from Hopkins and Morgan State held a meeting in a church to plan strategy for our picketing and our. It was customary on such occasions to sing a couple of freedom-type songs. It may seem quaint today, but it had an emotional impact on us then. And I can still recall the goose pimples that broke out of my skin as we all joined hands and sang, not "We Shall Overcome." We did sing that, of course, but what I remember most vividly was the singing of the Battle Hymn of the Republic by this group of black and white students that really brought the past and the present together for me. It may have been at that moment that I decided on a dissertation topic, a study of abolitionists during the Civil War and Reconstruction. Now, one of the first things we learn as historians and try to teach our students is not to generalize from a single example, especially if it's an example from our own experience. Nevertheless, I will offer this generalization. I think we're all influenced, not determined, but influenced in our choice of historical specialties and our perspective on our specialty by our own experiences and our own social environments. You've heard two examples of that already this morning, and now I'm telling you the third, so maybe there is more than a single generalization here. I'm well aware of the pitfalls of presentism, of weak history, of subjectivity, and all manner of other sins inherent in this hypothesis, but I'm convinced that there is a kind of reciprocity between the historian and his subject, between the present and the past. That's what makes history interesting, I think, to most people. And dare I use a buzzword from the 1960s, is what makes history relevant. In any case, I think my decision to write a dissertation on the abolitionists in the Civil War and afterward was shaped by the circumstances in which I found myself in 1960 and the early 1960s. The abolitionists were the civil rights activists of that day. And my dissertation told their story from 1860 to 1870. It became my first book. A spin-off from the research for that book became my second on the role of blacks, especially northern blacks in the Civil War. And a sequel carrying the story of the first, second, and third generation abolitionists down to the founding of the NAACP in 1910 became my third book. These projects have given me a reputation by 1975 or so as an historian of emancipation, of race relations, of black education, but not really as a Civil War historian. Then came an invitation to write a college textbook on the Civil War and Reconstruction. The timing was good because I developed a renewed interest in the war as a focal point, a turning point for all of the themes that engaged my teaching and research during the past 15 years or so. I accepted this textbook invitation, and not long after that I accepted a further invitation from Van Woodward and Shelton Meyer to write one of the volumes in the Oxford History of the United States. These two projects, which took almost a dozen years to complete, like Eric's experience with his 10-year project starting out as a 2-year project, my projects turned out to take 12 years. These two projects reinforce my initial interest in the themes of slavery, of emancipation, of civil rights, of black education during the war and Reconstruction, but they also broaden my perspective to include the political and military aspects of the era. Those activist reformers that I had initially studied so intensively did not operate in a vacuum. The radical policies they advocated were both constrained by and eventually advanced by political and military events. I became a student of Lincoln and of the multiple conflicting political pressures he had to negotiate and sometimes to manipulate. I also became a necessity a military historian. I've sometimes been asked how, having started as an historian of William Wade Garrison, Wendell Phillips, Frederick Douglass, and their world, I have become an historian of Billy Yank and Johnny Reb and their world. And the best answer I can give to that is to quote from Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address in 1865 after almost 4 years of war. All else chiefly depends upon the progress of our arms. That all else included the abolition of slavery and the reconstruction of the nation on the basis of the new birth of freedom that Lincoln had announced in the Gettysburg Address a year and a half earlier. So if I may conclude with another generalization from my own experience, I suspect that most historians find their interests widening outward. That's certainly true of us on this panel. Widening outward in several directions from their initial specialty, like widening circles in the water from a stone thrown into the pond. It's with that image of historian as stone thrower, not at glass houses, but into a pond that I wish to leave you.